to Story Time. On this cassette you can hear the story of The Hidden Garden. If you want to read the story and look at the pictures while you listen, collect together parts 3, 4 and 5 of Ariel's World. When you come to the end of the story in the first magazine, you'll hear this sound. Turn to the Storytime page in the next magazine. You may want to stop the tape while you do this. Now find the Storytime page in part 3 of Ariel's World, and we'll begin the story of The Hidden Garden. Ariel and Flounder had spent the afternoon deep down near the bottom of the ocean. They had been having a wonderful time floating on a cushion of warm bubbles at the hot springs. The bubbles exploded out of the rock in tall columns, and Flounder, who was very ticklish, kept trying different jets to see if he could find the most tickly one. Ariel loved the feeling of being as light as a sponge and lay floating gently on the tallest jet. She folded her arms behind her head and was daydreaming about whether there might be anything like this in the human world. Suddenly, she heard Flounder calling her. "Ariel, wake up! It's getting dark! We'd better head home!" Ariel opened her eyes wide. Flounder was right. There was never much light this far down, but now she could hardly see him, even though he was on the column beside her. "Time for some fin power, Flounder," she said. "Follow me." With a burst of speed they swam upwards, but it wasn't long before Ariel slowed down. "Flounder," she said quietly, "it's so dark that I can't see if we're going the right way. Do you recognize this?" Flounder glanced around him. They were in a corridor of a thick, ribbony seaweed called kelp. They had swum down one like it on their way to the hot springs. Was it this one or not? "Oh, help, Ariel! I don't know. Maybe we're lost." Just then a cluster of tiny lights flashed out of the kelp in front of him and disappeared into the weed at the other side of the corridor. Flounder let out a shriek. "It's all right, silly," said Ariel. "It's only a family of lanternfish out for an evening swim. Let's keep going along here. We should get to a big pointed rock in a minute, and then we turn right for the palace." Flounder did feel a bit embarrassed at being frightened by some harmless little fish, so he swam along behind Ariel, chanting to himself, "Don't be a fool, just keep cool. Don't be a fool, just keep cool." He spotted a single small light up ahead, close to the kelp on the opposite side. "Just lanternfish, tiny lanternfish," he muttered as he swam up. Then suddenly he realized that he was looking at the glowing spine of a terrifying viper fish. Its mouth was slightly open and he could see a row of vicious fangs. "Ariel!" he shrieked at the top of his voice as he dived into the thick wall of kelp beside him. When Ariel turned round, all she could see was the long spine, dark shining eyes and sharp teeth of the viperfish as it swam towards her. didn't panic. She knew that the viperfish was after Flounder. If she stayed perfectly still, it would probably swim right by. She held her breath as it darted past, its spine still glowing and its tail lashing furiously. The kelp corridor was dark once again. Ariel waited for a couple of minutes until she was sure the viperfish had really gone. Then she called out Flounder's name. Her voice echoed down the corridor as she swam back to where she had last heard Flounder shouting. She thought she heard his muffled voice, but she couldn't work out where it was coming from. "Flounder, where are you? I'm still in the corridor." Next moment she heard a familiar voice from behind her. "Here I am," he called. "Oh, Flounder, thank goodness! Where were you hiding?" "Come and see, come and see!" Flounder was bobbing up and down with excitement. "Through here!" Flounder started to push his way through the seaweed, and Ariel swam close behind him. Suddenly, from the weedy darkness of the kelp, they stumbled into a dazzlingly bright chamber of pink and yellow corals. They were so bright they shone all round them like thousands of fairy lights. Ariel couldn't believe her eyes. "Have you ever seen anything so beautiful?" she whispered to Flounder. "Thought you'd like it," Flounder beamed. "And here's a special ledge for you to sit on. It can be our very own secret garden." Ariel sat down on the ledge and looked at the pretty corals all around. They waved their delicate tentacles and seemed to dance for her. It was perfect. They could come here whenever they needed some peace and quiet, and nobody would ever find them. Then she had an idea. "Flounder, I know you found this place and that we both want to keep it secret, but do you think we could share it with Sebastian?" "Whatever you say, Ariel, but I wouldn't want him to bring along the whole band." "Oh, no, I mean just the three of us. I can't wait to show him." The two friends marked the exact spot of the entrance into the garden by tying some strands of Ariel's lovely red hair round one of the stalks. Then Ariel spotted the big pointed rock they had seen on their way to the hot springs. "This way, Flounder," she called, and they sped back to the palace. The next morning they had to wait for what seemed like ages while Sebastian was in a meeting with King Triton. At last he was free, and they all set off for the secret garden. Ariel and Flounder were going far too fast for Sebastian. "Slow down, girl," he called out. They each grabbed a claw and towed him. At last they came to the kelp corridor. They swam along slowly, looking for their marked door. Finding it, Flounder led the way. When Sebastian scuttled in, he was astonished. "Well, I never! Did you ever see a magical place? So private!" He was so amazed he couldn't finish a single sentence. Ariel and Flounder were laughing at him when suddenly Ariel noticed a group of parrotfish. They were noisily crunching at the corals in a corner of the garden. They had already eaten away a huge patch. "Oh, no!" cried Ariel. "Sebastian, we've got to stop them before they ruin our whole garden." When the music ends, turn the cassette over. Ariel swam over to the bright blue parrotfish who were busily nibbling chunks off the pink and yellow corals. "Excuse me," she began politely. "I wonder if you would mind feeding somewhere else. You see, this is our special coral garden, and we'd like to keep it the way it is."
"Garden?" snapped the biggest parrotfish. "I don't see any garden. Just rows and rows of the most delicious pink and yellow coral, which happen to be far and away our most favourite food. How would you like it if some busybody asked you not to eat your most scrummy meal ever just because it looked pretty?
And the parrotfish carried on chomping. Ariel could see that she wasn't getting very far with the greedy fish, so she beckoned Sebastian and Flounder to follow her out of the garden. Once they were in the corridor, she whispered, "What are we going to do? We can't let them destroy our beautiful secret garden." "Well, there's not much point in trying to push them out," said Flounder. "They'll simply bite our noses off. Just look what damage they're doing to that coral. And anyway, they'd just come back." Sebastian frowned deeply. He was trying to think. Then he clicked his claws and exclaimed, "I've got it. Time to call on some shellfish friends of mine who owe me a favor." Sebastian set off briskly, and Ariel and Flounder followed. As they swam along, Sebastian explained his plan. When the parrotfish left the garden that night, he was going to ask a family of murex shells to squirt some of their purple dye over the pink and yellow corals. Then the next day, when the parrotfish returned for another meal, they would think they were in the wrong place. They'd probably turn tail and swim off. Ariel and Flounder were delighted with Sebastian's idea. So too were the murex shells, who were grazing in a rocky spot not far away. When Sebastian asked them to help, they said they would be glad to do a spot of dyeing. They assured the worried Ariel that the colour would wash off after a few days. They were rather small and slow-moving, so perhaps the friends would give them a hand with transport. Half the family clambered up onto Flounder's back, and Ariel carried the rest of them in her hands. With Sebastian following close behind, the little troop moved off to a spot outside the secret garden. Here the murex shells decided to wait in hiding until the parrotfish went home for the night. Then they would creep in and do their work. Ariel, Sebastian and Flounder said goodbye to the kind murex family and swam back to the palace. Ariel woke several times in the night worrying about what was happening in their lovely garden. Early the next morning, the three friends returned and hid themselves in the curtain of kelp outside the coral garden, waiting for the parrotfish to arrive. Soon they heard a bossy voice saying, this way, hurry up." And then 5 blue parrotfish pushed their way through the weed and into the garden. There was a stunned silence. Then the hidden friends heard another fishy voice say, "This isn't pink and yellow coral, you silly old fool. I thought you said you knew the way." I thought I did. Anyway, why didn't you pay attention to the route? Why is it always my fault?" said the first voice from inside the garden. Then there was another silence. Ariel, Sebastian and Flounder grinned at each other in their weedy hiding place. The plan seemed to be working beautifully. "And you youngsters," said the first voice angrily, "you should have been looking where you were going instead of quarrelling and leaving everything up to Mummy and me as usual." The next moment, out rushed the largest parrotfish, huffing crossly, followed by the rest of the family. They were shouting at each other angrily as they swam off down the corridor. The friends waited until the parrotfish were out of sight. Then they made their way into the garden. The murex shells had done an excellent job. The beautiful pink and yellow coral beds had turned a dreary purplish blue, with not a chink of colour showing through. The little shellfish crept out from under a ledge, and Sebastian congratulated them warmly.
"I think we need to congratulate you too, Sebastian," laughed Ariel, "for thinking up such a wizard trick. You're a real C.
"A what?" asked Sebastian.
"A clever, cunning and crafty crustacean, of course."
That was the story of how Sebastian's friends, the Murex family, saved Ariel's hidden garden from the parrotfish.